Hello, humans. Welcome back to the study of the Bible in chronological order. Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 to 34. Now, in Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 to 9, it is written that Abraham prepares a huge feast to celebrate that Isaac has now been weaned from his mother's milk. However, on the day that was supposed to be a joyous occasion, Sarah, she sees Ishmael mocking. And so in verse 10, she explodes with rage and she demands for Abraham to drive out Hagar and Ishmael, saying, "The son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac." Now, in those ancient times, a toddler was typically weaned between ages 2 to 3. And since Genesis 17, verse 25, informs us that Ishmael had been 13 years of age, 1 year prior to the birth of Isaac, we know that Ishmael would have been 14 years old when Isaac was born. Thus, by the time Isaac was weaned, Ishmael would have been between 16 to 17 years old. Now, when Scripture says that Ishmael was mocking, that is the Hebrew word tzachach, and it implies, yes, mocking, jesting, and laughing outright, either in merriment or scorn. And it is as if to make sport of someone. Now, considering the context of the passage centering around Isaac being weaned, it is reasonable to infer that Ishmael made a crude joke about Isaac no longer being able to be on Sarah's breasts, perhaps even implying that, maybe Isaac relied on Sarah's breasts longer than he should have. Now, we don't know, but we do know that whatever he did say, it caused Sarah to erupt in anger. Now, noteworthy is the fact that this same Hebrew word for mocking, well, it was also used back in Genesis 17:17 and Genesis 18:12, when both Abraham and Sarah laughed at the thought of them having a child in their old ages. Well, it is also the same word used in Genesis 19:14, when Lot's sons-in-law believed he was jesting about the coming judgment. And this same word is also used in Judges chapter 16, verse 25, when Samson, after being blinded, was forced to be sport before the Philistines and entertained them. Therefore, this word implies the use of sarcasm. Now, the only difference between Abraham and Sarah laughing and Ishmael laughing was that Abraham and Sarah had laughed within while trying to be respectful, whereas Ishmael laughed for all to see while being blatantly disrespectful. And though Sarah had previously been guilty of the same sarcastic laughter, she allowed hatred in her heart toward Hagar and Ishmael, considering their sins worse than her own. Now, even though the birth of Ishmael via Hagar had been Sarah's idea, if you remember back in Genesis 16:2, that was Sarah's idea. Well, she saw how both Hagar and Ishmael had pridefully disrespected her. Hagar, back in Genesis 16, verse 4, if you remember, when she conceived, she found out she was pregnant, she despised Sarah. And now this with Ishmael. And so Sarah now demands for Abraham to drive them away. Now, the first eruption between Sarah and Hagar is recorded in Genesis 16, verses 5 to 15, when Sarah drove Hagar away. But then the Lord brought her back, and Abraham welcomed her back. Now, for this reason, Sarah now demands that Abraham be the one to drive them away. So I believe that Sarah knew that if Abraham was the one to drive them away, they would not return. At first glance, it seems as if Sarah made an unnecessary and rash decision and an overreacted emotional outburst However, it's easy to overlook the fact that Sarah allowed Hagar and Ishmael to remain with them for at least 16 to 17 years, including the 2 to 3 years that she had Isaac. And because she had Isaac 2 to 3 years prior to this eruption that led to this eviction, it is evident that Sarah did not want to simply drive them away because she had Isaac. No, because if that were the case, then she would have demanded them to be driven away as soon as she had given birth to Isaac. This is 2 to 3 years after the fact. So rather, it seems evident that Sarah's presented case to Abraham for the need of them to be driven away, it had accumulated evidence over several years. And then Ishmael's disrespectful mockery, whatever it was, as the saying goes, became the straw that broke the camel's back. And it is written in Genesis 21, now verse 11, that the thought of driving Hagar and Ishmael away, it brought Abraham grief because he considered Ishmael to be his son. However, it's written in verses 12 to 13, but God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, for through Isaac your descendants shall be named. And the son of the maid I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant." So when God says to Abraham, well, what he says is interesting, because he identifies Hagar as an Amah, which means a maidservant or a female slave. Therefore, God himself declares that even though Abraham had taken Hagar as his second wife, remember back in Genesis 16, verse 3, she was not his wife. Moreover, God identifies Ishmael as a Naer, which means a young man, but by implication, one who is also a servant. Hence, this is why God, using the Hebrew word for son, which is bain, he identifies Ishmael as Hagar's son and not Abraham's son. And again, that word bain for son, we had discussed that back in Genesis chapter 6, if you would like to go review that. However, God says that even though Ishmael is Hagar's son, he is still Abraham's Zarah, which means seed. So God says, therefore, he will still make a nation from Ishmael because he is Abraham's seed. In fact, this is what the Lord had promised back in Genesis 16, verse 10, when the Lord appeared to Hagar as the angel of the Lord. So, what was Abraham's response? Faithful obedience. However, Abraham's love is quite evident because in Genesis 21, now verse 14, it is written that he rises early in the morning and he gives Hagar bread and water for her journey. Now this means that even though God had told him the day before that he is permitted to send Hagar and Ishmael away, Abraham allowed them to sleep in comfort that night. He did not send them away while it was dark outside. In addition, he gave them food and water, which he didn't have to do. But Abraham wanted to provide for them the best timing for their journey and resources that would aid in their survival. And then Hagar and Ishmael, as it is written, departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. So in Genesis 21, now verses 15 to 18, with all the water now gone, Hagar, she abandons Ishmael under a bush, and she travels about a bow shot away from him in order to be alone because she does not want to see him die. Now, according to Jewish tradition, the length of a bow shot is about half a mile, which is 880 yards. I mean, y'all just watched the Super Bowl probably. So 880 yards. Think about it. That is the distance of almost 9 American football fields. It is written that Hagar was facing the opposite way so as not to see Ishmael. But could he still see her? Well, depending on the landscape, yeah, it's possible. Regardless, at age 16 to 17, he would have been smart enough at that point to realize that Hagar desired to separate from him, and he would have felt abandoned. He would have felt unloved. Now, interestingly, Scripture describes Hagar weeping loudly, and yet it is written that God heard the lad crying. And then an angel calls to Hagar from heaven and says, "Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is." And then Hagar is then instructed to return to Ishmael and to comfort him because the Lord will make a nation of him. Now, the fact that Scripture states how God hears Ishmael's cries, right, and he does not hear her cries, to me, that seems to imply that his cries were justified, whereas her cries were unwarranted. Why? Well, if you remember back in Genesis 16, verse 10, the Lord promised Hagar that he would multiply her descendants and that they would be too many to count. In addition, in verse 12, so Genesis 16, verse 12, the Lord had already told Hagar and that Ishmael, he will live to the east of all his brothers. Therefore, if the Lord had told her that she was going to have countless descendants and that Ishmael would have brothers and would live east of them, why would she faithlessly abandon Ishmael to die? Her actions could not be considered as being morally right because she chose to place her own feelings over the feelings and well-being of her only son, whom the Lord promised would live and become a nation. A mother is supposed to selflessly love her child to the very end. Even wild animals do that. Hagar's circumstance currently in this story does not match God's promised description of what is to come. Hence, God ignoring her cries, yet hearing the cries of Ishmael, it seems to be a silent rebuke of her decisions to selfishly abandon her son and faithlessly doubt God's promises. Thus, this incident reveals that God keeps his promises. But it also reveals just how much love God has for those whom the world cares nothing about. Both Hagar and Ishmael, they were considered to be poor, homeless, peasant nomads by the world's standards, yet life is always precious and valuable in God's sight. Now, in Genesis chapter 21, verse 19, after Hagar returns to Ishmael, God opens her eyes and enables her to see a well of water from where they may drink and sustain their lives. So, why did God wait until all of their initial water supply was gone and Hagar traveled half a mile away from Ishmael before acknowledging them, redirecting them, and blessing them? Well, simply put, God's reasoning for the way he does things has to do with God's perfect timing, of his perfect plan, of his perfect will for our discipline and our sanctification. Much of what God chooses to do often seems evil from our limited perspectives as finite and fallible beings, but it is because we cannot see the overall big picture of salvation as God sees it. However, if we trust in the Lord, then just as it is written in Romans 8:28, we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Think about it. By God allowing the initial water supply to run out, Hagar ran into another dead-end wall. Now, if you recall, do you remember back in Genesis 16, verses 7 and 13 to 14, the Lord transformed a dead-end wall into a well of life for her. Do you remember? And because she now knows the Lord from that experience, he showed her the same God who saved her then is the same God who saves her now. Also, the Lord showed her once again that there is no life apart from the Lord, and that she most certainly can trust in the Lord to fulfill his promises. Though Hagar and Ishmael had been separated from Abraham's care, this story reveals that nothing can separate us from the love of God. And Paul talks about that in Romans 8:38 to 39. And so God sometimes allows us to go through things so we can learn, and then he can redirect us and open our eyes to the living water. Sometimes we need to find out the hard way that our ways are not the way. And so the story concludes in Genesis 21, verses 20 to 21 by saying, God was with the lad, and he grew, and he lived in the wilderness and became an archer. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. God was with Ishmael. And as Paul will later write in Romans 8:31, if God is for us, who is against us? It is written that Ishmael became an archer. Well, this seems to explain why the distance between him and his mother in verse 16 was described as about a bow shot away, right? Ishmael had been driven out into the wilderness in verse 14. That is where God was with him while he learned to survive. And so it seems he simply chose to remain in the wilderness. But the harsh environment is probably what led him to becoming a wild donkey of a man, which is what the Lord said he would be back in Genesis 16, verse 12. But why did Hagar get a wife for him from the land of Egypt? Well, if you remember, Genesis 16, verse 1 informs us that Hagar was Egyptian. Therefore, it is likely that Ishmael's wife had been one of Hagar's relatives. And as we will soon see in our chronological journey, all the way in Genesis chapter 37, we will see that Joseph will be sold by his own brothers as a slave to Ishmaelites who are traveling to Egypt. And the Ishmaelites will arrive just in time to buy Joseph's life in order to save him from death. And so even at this very moment, in this current story, when all things seem to be hopelessly wrong for Hagar and Ishmael, God is with them and is even putting his perfect plan in place for the future, for Joseph, and for all nations who will end up being saved through Joseph. So, the next time you find yourself asking, why, Lord, did you allow this to happen? Remember, God is with you. And he is even putting his perfect plan into place right now, even for future incidents. of what will seem to be dead-end walls of despair. And it will be there at the Wailing Wall. If you seek the Lord in prayer, He will open your eyes and He will enable you to see the living water so that your life may be revived. And it is written in Genesis 21, verse 22, "Now it came about at that time that Abimelech and Pichol, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, 'God is with you in all that you do.'" And then the story goes on in verses 23 to 34 to describe how Abimelech and Abraham make a covenant with each other at Beersheba. Therefore, Scripture informs us that God was with Ishmael at the same time that God was with Abraham, even though a great distance separated the two. And just as the incident with Hagar and Ishmael leads to future plans involving Joseph, well, the town of Beersheba, it leads to future plans as well, because it actually becomes famous as marking the southern boundary of the nation of Israel. Therefore, these simultaneous stories are yet more examples of God's omnipresence, omniscience, omnipotence, and even His omnibenevolence. Truly, God is in all places. He knows all things. He's all-powerful, and He is all good. Further questions to consider, though. Can you now see how Abraham's decision to take a second wife created catastrophic consequences? Can you see how important it is that we adhere to God's design and live according to His will? Are you able to recognize how God takes our bad decisions and creates good outcomes from them? How will we ever learn to be dependent upon the Lord alone unless we are removed from everyone and everything we have become dependent upon? Is there someone or something you are depending upon that is blocking your intimate relationship of trust with the Lord? Is your water supply empty? Have you encountered a dead-end wall of despair? Will you cry out to the Lord so that He can open your eyes and enable you to see the living water so that your life may be revived once again? God is with you. God is with you, and God is causing all things to work together for your good according to His purposes. Do you believe this? Until next time, remember, God is with you.